Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in September 2022. I'm here with Marius, and we're going to have a panel on threat modeling adoption in disciplines other than development and security, right, in a way. And I think it's a fascinating topic because I've always believed that threat model has so much value it can give to an organization, right? And it tends to kind of be locked sometimes in the security kind of cupboard. And especially when you apply the worldly maps, which we'll cover that in a bit. So I'm Dinis Cruz. I helped with the summit. I'm the chief scientist of Glasswall, also the CISO of Holland Barrett. I keep myself busy these days, and I'm a massive fan of threat modeling since the first times I saw it. And I did have a massive epiphany when I realized that threat models can give, worldly maps can give threat models context. And I'm a big fan of trying to automate and graphs and everything like that. So, Marius, quick intro from you.
Yeah, so Marius, currently working for a Glow as senior security engineer, but I think the title doesn't really sum up. I'm the first security person in, so juggling quite a few hats, building strategy for the business, security operations, red teaming, helping embed security in SDLC, and many more interesting things, basically. So, yeah. And yeah, obviously, kind of touched on, you touched a bit on threat modeling. I think loads of people preempt that threat modeling is only going to be used in kind of development. And yeah, I think we can use the, threat modeling in various aspects within the business, whether it's, architecture, whether you're building systems or anywhere else. I think it's a great example how we can, leverage and build something that is secure from the get-go.
Cool. So let me start by defining your experience on threat modeling and where you used it, and then maybe trying to get some examples of how you transcended security, because it comes from a security requirement originally.
Yeah, I think the key point is, and what I understood early on, and especially I think originally I started using obviously when I was back in Domino's, we started embedding DevSecOps. So obviously the key point was, in any development life cycles to shift security left, so embed threat modeling. But I think the key point is understanding and I think where some people miss the concept of it, is that if you're doing threat modeling by yourself somewhere in the corner or in the office, you're doing it wrong. Threat modeling is sort of is a team kind of activity, team engagement, and I think sort of that's where the concept comes from DevSecOps, as building sort of a secure culture. So you understand and teach the development teams the benefits of threat modeling, and then you teaching them how they can quantify the risk based on likelihood and impact. Yeah. And then you basically bring the, return of investment on security, how we can shift all of the, security potential problems down to the left and basically, increase the resiliency and kind of security of the system as we build. So, examples where, we built quite a few systems and, it is bringing that together, development, security, operations, making sure that we, create the data flow diagrams and see where the potential problems arise. So you have to think as an attacker, see where could potentially weaknesses lie and how we could exploit, and making sure we bring down to kind of acceptable company risk level. And that's the key. But I think the key point is collaboration and looking that kind of from attacker perspective, and then showing the benefits obviously to everyone.
Mm-hmm. So in that world, right, threat model, so it's already, I would say, more evolved, right? Because we've gone past the fact that people are questioning, why we do this. We're doing it. We show to the technical teams, which now see the value. And I guess the sweet spot for this is when you show this to business individuals or to people outside of development, they also see a lot of value in the threat model.
Yeah, definitely, and that's the point. Sometimes people say, "Oh, we're wasting time, on meetings doing threat modelings." But as we can show, and I think most of the organizations, if you can show the value in terms of how we bolt security down the line and how we save time when we shift that left and start doing that at the design stage, it's a big change and a big kind of shift in mindset. But I think the problem is, it's a shift in mindset and culture, because that's it depends on where you are in your journey or an organization. If you have been working sort of in waterfall kind of development kind of cycles, it's a big shift, it's a big change, it's the big, how you split the teams, how you show the value, and all of that takes a long time to shift it. Nothing can happen overnight.
Yeah.
I think, and I've been talking about this because I kind of built the DevSecOps framework, kind of stole a few ideas from AWS, and I think they're doing a great job in terms of shifting the responsibility and kind of the ownership of the risk into the development teams, and how we kind of raise the bar as in security being this kind of the stage gate, the quality stage gate at every level, and how we can raise that bar higher and higher as we do the threat modeling throughout that life cycle. So I think that's the kind of key proponent in making sure that we iterate it at every level and get better and better at it.
Yeah, but in a way, the evolution of that is to give the responsibility to the business, right? Which is why I think the natural evolution of threat model is to add value to the business, is to basically, find ways to represent from a business owner point of view, what are the threats that basically they are signing off. And I do feel that a lot of times, one of the biggest challenges that we have is we have a lot of business individuals, basically they're the ones who own almost the roadmap. They making a lot of calls without having proper context. And then it's easy to blame them and say, oh, these guys don't have a clue, but actually it's not fair, because a lot of times they don't have good data. They don't understand the difference between decision A, decision B, decision C, right? And I think the threat model, or actually multiple threat models, actually allow you to do that. I remember once I done this thing where we created 3 threat models because there was 3 ways to implement the solution. And it was almost insanely easy to make the right decision, although we still let them make the right decision. When you look at it and you had decision A, very little threads, bad usability, decision B or solution B, some risks, but good usability. Decision C, insane risks, a bit better usability. You look at it going, whoa, I'm going to go, almost like the advantage of the usability benefit at that moment in time. It's not linear with the risk increase that you have there. And the interesting thing about this, especially with risk, the way that I think risk should be structured is that whoever signs off for risk, he needs to be signed off by him, by his boss, by his boss, by his boss's boss. So it's not just the manager who needs to sign off, or the business owner. He needs to sign off in a way that his boss, or whoever takes responsibility for his risks, also take accountability for, right? And I think once you can present it like that, it becomes easier for the right individuals who in a way got control in development, right? The product teams, should sometimes, in a product-driven company should control development. They need good data to do that. And I think threat models can give them that.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I've been listening to, for example, Greg van der Graas talking about how, in some ways, some of the systems are flawed, because in some ways, I think security departments are kind of stuck in the field of just doing IT and security.
Yeah.
And I'm the big proponent of reaching out to the business segments and departments and seeing, how we can help. Not a lot of people, for example, think about security, for example, in HR. What tools are HR using? How we can do potentially a threat model of the tools and processes that HR uses, business development uses, and how we can, bring that kind of return on investment and making sure we reduce risks throughout the whole organization. If, for example, I'm a big proponent as well in talking about, for example, business development, how we can portray our, not only the threat modeling, but our security to potential customers, to potential clients, how, sometimes even adding a slide or 2 on our security capabilities, on our security posture to potential clients and partners can show, that, oh, these guys are doing this and this, we want to work with them. And I think that's a huge benefit in business these days. So I think threat modeling can, you can reach out to anywhere in the business and potentially return on investment and bring value to that, as long as you can portray and make people understand where the risks are, and then you can make a line to business risk appetite. It's a great way of doing it.
Absolutely. James, you want to chip in?
Hello. Sorry, I thought I'd slowly introduce myself in by turning my camera on. So Marius, I mean, introducing threat modeling into the businesses is absolutely great, absolutely great idea. But there's a bit of a pill to sugar, Because if you call something a threat model, people instantly get a little bit scared. They worry they're going to do it wrong, especially out of, you know, teams outside of IT teams who may not have heard of this concept. And something that we've been trying to introduce at a fintech and doing quite well is a concept called speed stride. So the first thing we did was we just didn't call it threat modeling, called it speed stride. Sounds cool, and we're using obviously the stride methodology to try and introduce this into other areas of the business. So for instance, we have a HR team who, when they're trying to implement something new, we'll ask them to perhaps look at the spoofing, tampering, and repudiation. They don't really need to know about denial of service in HR. No one's going to try and stop the HR department working in their everyday working. But spoofing, tampering, and repudiation is something that's absolutely applicable to HR teams, and when they're communicating with the business and they're communicating with potential hires. So we asked them to do a speed stride. It should take them no more than a minute to quickly fire up a spreadsheet. They put a minute timer on, and they, for each of those 3 subjects, they just try and figure out, could someone pretend to be someone here? Could someone pretend to, could someone, you know, lie to us to get this information? Could somebody tamper and get this information and perhaps cause havoc inside the business? And when we made a game of it, when we gamified it like that, people found it a lot easier to digest and to repeat as well. And then as a security team, we'll come in and have a look at those and kind of add to them, give a bit more guidance, makes us a little bit more friendly as well, that we're getting involved in the things they're doing. So yeah, it's an absolute speed stride, we called it, to make it a little bit less scary, but it can work anywhere in the business.
Yeah, I think the key point is, you know, obviously, if you jump on and say to someone in your business, or for example HR, can you do a threat model? Obviously they won't have a clue, but it's a teach in progress. And I think that's the key point. You know, once you do 1 or 2 of them with them, you teach them the concepts, because obviously, you know, threat modeling, I think that's the key point, is you walk through them through potential threats and make them think, you know, if I'm looking outside in, what could I potentially try and exploit? Because again, at the end of the day, I think the point is, and sometimes people miss, the point is that, you know, normally the threat actors, they will look for low-hanging fruit, because obviously they want the minimum effort for the maximum impact. So obviously our key point as defenders is to make them walk away and go somewhere, find something easier. And I think that's the concept, you know, because, you know, talking about methodologies, obviously you might not ask them to do stride. You can you know, do attack trees. You can do security cards nowadays. You know, people do, you know, start doing, you know, card games. You can obviously gamify. There's a whole conferences around it, how we can, you know, potentially gamify things like that and make it easier for people to get involved. Because I think once you've done or reached some departments, then, you know, it kind of runs itself if you do a methodology. So it's a sort of run through.
Yeah, absolutely.
No,
oh, sorry.
No, go on.
Who's jumping in? No, absolutely. And I think one of the things that, you know, we try to use real world analogies as well. Like, again, you know, if we said make a threat model, and you just alluded to there, they wouldn't know. People would start thinking we're making little Warhammer type things. And so, you know, using real world analogies to people outside of not just our part of you know, security, but tech as well. People in tech tend to get this stuff better, but even people outside of tech don't really understand the concept of somebody coming in and doing this stuff. So using some real world analogies, which may seem really obvious, right? We talk about it now, it may seem really obvious to give some real world analogies, but, you know, to your description there, I would say to our HR department, we only have to make our car a little bit more harder to steal outside the next door's car, and they get that. You know, they think, oh, okay, I know, I understand, I have a car on the drive. So yeah, using real world analogies, trying to not dumb it down, but just make it into non-IT, non-sex speak as possible for people to kind of get that. Using front, you know, instead of, you know, ingress and egress points, use the front door, use the back door in the house. People kind of tend to understand that language, and it really, really helps. But I'd love to hear more about the cards. The cards sound like a really cool thing.
Yeah, because there's various obviously games that people develop, because you can, for example, there is a game with the cards, but there's potential, for example, threat modeling that do based on personas, so you can develop a specific character, specific personas, or what they could do potentially, and then you can attribute to your threat model. And the same is with the cards. You can have stride cards, and then basically you look through your data flow diagram and then see what potential cards apply, and then you can develop a hint of sort of what to do and how to secure it. So yeah, I think the key point as well, what you just mentioned as well, I wanted to mention and to touch as well. Sometimes as we as security folks, sometimes we forget that once you start reaching out and facing business, you need to sometimes translate some of these aspects and theories and into the way that people understand. And nowadays, a lot younger people especially coming in, I think it's the great place to come into cybersecurity, but there's people that are coming in from various other industries that bring those skills, because not all technical people have potentially skills to, especially when you start talking to HR, you start presenting to the board, you need to talk in business terms that everybody could understand. So, because I say to always the people, especially I mentor quite a lot of people coming into the industry, I say, you can be great at technical, you can bring an amazing idea, but if you can't influence, your idea will never gonna get to fruition. And that's the key skill that you need to leverage as well.
Yeah. And I think the key concept there is communication and translation, right? Is to bring these concepts to an audience and speak in their language, speak in a way that they understand, which is actually interesting, because I do think that threat model does translate to that, because if you forget about security and technology, the business knows about threats. They know about risk. People have risk boards left, right, and center, sometimes on spreadsheets, right? But they do have it left, right, and center. Like you see a project talking about the risk of this, the risk of that. If this happens, nothing to do with technology, or the risk of a supply. Like you said, we have a critical supply here. How do we handle that? How we route these things, etc. So I do think that the threat model as a concept really applies. And in a way, the more we can get the business to adopt these practices, the better or the easier our job becomes, because not only they start pushing threat models, we then get business-focused threat models, so that when we connect our ones, we can say, well, that risk that you just talked about it, here are 3 ways that can become reality, right? Or you can say, well, we're worried about all these risks, but if I compare these risks with the one that the business is worried about, this is barely moving the needle, right? So I think there's a lot of great power in trying and creating technology, workflows, documentation, books, all sorts of things, graphs, right, to connect, that allows us to be doing threat models themselves outside of security and even outside of engineering.
Well, yeah, exactly. And especially, as you just mentioned, threat modeling, I think the key point of threat modeling is it's based on risk, and everyone in the business understands the language of risk. So once you can portray that to whatever methodology of risk management you're using, it comes into layman terms of what is acceptable and what is not, what we're going to mitigate and what we won't mitigate. I think the key point as well to mention sometimes that threat modeling, I think, really works if we can break down into manageable chunks. It's very hard if we try and threat model the whole system or the whole, platform that we're trying to build, or the whole of department. I think if we try and break it into smaller chunks, into smaller manageable chunks, and split it between the teams that are responsible for that chunk of the business, I think that's the key aspect of how we can bring value of threat modeling.
Absolutely, which basically means that you need a threat model, which is a graph of graphs, right? You wanna basically have threat models that are connected, so you can actually have the bigger one, the smaller one, etc. Which is, look, the only threat model that I've seen that I looked at and going, this could really have possible to scale, is when we were putting all the components in Jira, we created the connections, and we were visualizing the threat model using Jupyter notebooks, right? And what that started to allow us to do is to go to stakeholders and go, hey, this is what your world looks like, but also be able to do multiple passes of threat models. So you don't have one, you have 10, you have 20, and you almost have, I really like to do threat models almost aligned to user stories. Like you said, the context. I think, if you look at some thread models, they mix, it's like the OSI layer, like you almost jump from layers to layers. You're like, whoa, hold on, right? If I'm talking about this, I don't want to care about something that happens 3 layers deep, because I should almost have a separate thread model just about how you manage that. And it's really powerful to look at user flows or even use cases as a thread model, because you can then ask much more interesting questions. In fact, you start to hit the business very fast because you're looking at a particular use case.
Yeah, and especially that's the case because when I was building for Domino's, you want to align, because you don't want to disrupt the development teams. You want to align to their process work. So that's why you would like to split your thread modeling into user stories and into managing chunks, because that's how they work. And they can align the thread models based on user stories, because that's what's on their board and that's what they're delivering. So it's very easy to manage. It's very quick because user stories are quite small in chunks, and you can do a thread model quite quick. So once you get a few of them done, and then you teach them what's the likelihood and impact, they can own the process, and you become sort of an escalation point where somewhere risk is not unacceptable. How else we can bring it down? What other controls we can introduce, because we ran out of ideas? And then you just build an escalation point, and then if something goes really bad, then you do a penetration test, and that kind of becomes a workflow of your management kind of system of the whole of development lifecycle.
So how are you storing the thread model, right? The graph, the nodes, so that you can then scale what you just described, which is spot on, but you need a world where you can manage this using a graph, right? Because systems change, things change, you need a dynamic flow so you even you could see multiple views, right? There's a, you in a complex system, the threads almost makes more sense to say, okay, I'm now looking from this attack vector from this point of view. Well, these are what the threads look like. Well, I'm now going to look from this type of attack. Well, this is what the threads look like. How do you manage your thread models?
It's not as easy as someone would think, because we tried playing with the Microsoft tool, and it doesn't really scale.
Yep.
So it comes back down to either using what you said with Jira, or creating kind of worldly maps where you represent something sort of with a sort of tabs and how you represent the specific items in a system. But yeah, once you start bolting on and you want to see views, then it becomes complicated how you bring everything together and get one view or get specific views. So I think Jira is probably the best way you can do it. Yeah,
it's really cool, man. When you get it to work, right? I remember this really cool session once where this this business exec was like, I own checkout. It's like, I was like, what do you think checkout actually means? And he draw like things. And then we literally brought down a graph to say, this is what checkout means, right? This is every system that you're depending on. By the way, see all these third parties, every one of them can become a single point of failure, right? And it was really cool because we were able to actually talk about from a business point of view, right? We were able to talk about the architecture, the systems, the solutions, right? The things that they want to develop. But a lot of it was business, was strategy, right? So it's really cool, and I do think that in this case, the more we can get the business to be involved in threat models, the more they will bring these practices, and also the more they will push for scalable solutions.
Yeah, exactly, and I think because once you address sort of the development lifecycle, there's DLC, then you start expanding, because development, not only development, but depends on obviously what business you work in, but supply chain, that's one thing you can always tackle with threat modeling and see what connections you have, where third parties are embedded within your platform, within your system, within your business, and that kind of becomes a management and kind of seeing what potentially can go wrong. And sometimes a third party has another third party connection somewhere else, and there's a whole chain of events that could happen, and threat modeling it brings that to light, and brings that sort of to visualize what can happen, and how we can go from management point of view, how we can manage and reduce the potential risks.
Okay, so now here's a really cool question, right? So I'm a big fan of economic and models, right? I think if you almost like you understand how something will work, and that's why Worldly Maps is so awesome, right? But if you want to understand how something works, you need to look at the reward systems. You need to look at the ecosystem that something lives in, right? So this is a bit politically correct, but I still think that security today is still a marketing exercise. There's a lot of companies that if they get away with not having really good security because there's a really, it's even internally, there's not a good understanding of their security posture, might as well to the outside world, right? Which also means that the market doesn't work, right? Because you're not able to make good security decisions, which is a problem. Like if you want to, buy 3 products, even us security professionals, if I want to commission, a new product or service that I'm using, I don't get good security data from those. And even though we do third-party vendor assessments, a lot of them are very sugar-coated, right? So one of the things that really changed the economics in the industry was when the regulatory of the financial services forced companies to publish their annual accounts, right? Like public companies have to publish what they do, right? I actually think that we need the same thing for security and for companies, which basically means that you really should have an understanding of somebody else's security posture. Now, I think we're a bit far away from companies actually publishing some of the big weaknesses, but I actually think that threat models will be a great way for companies to be forced to publish, teams internally forced to know, because look, I can look at 3 threat models and I can tell you straight away which team understands about security and which teams has no idea that they're playing with radioactivity. And actually, in history, and we have good data to know that the more a team understands the side effects of what they do, the more secure they're going to be, because there's a positive feedback loop, right? So what do you think of the idea of eventually we get to a mode where threat models have to be published from both technology, process, but also from a business point of view?
Yeah, I think that comes down to obviously legislation and accountability, because if you talk about even security vendors, there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of discussion that there's a lot of snake oil, because there's there's people who not necessarily are in the know and they're buying solutions that not necessarily will help them, because someone advertising that I'm going to reduce your attack surface by 98%. How you can tell that to someone? Knowing the data behind it, because what you've done for one customer not necessarily mean that you will achieve the same for the next customer. And that's where the big problem aligns, because I think in some ways, and I think probably that's kind of an old school thinking, but I think people are changing their mindset now, because you can't embed security just by adding tooling. We can still keep forgetting about hygiene, about hardening systems, about removing unnecessary services, and and you're just I'm just gonna add this amazing MDR, EDR solution that's gonna solve everything. No, it won't.
You could actually have a negative risk impact, right?
Well, exactly, because don't forget,
you can add a tool, and the tool might actually add more risk than it's removing.
Well, exactly, and sometimes people as well forget, buying a tool, you have to make sure that it integrates with your ecosystem as well, because adding a tool that doesn't work with your SIEM or doesn't work with your EDR, or you need to do some data manipulation because logging does not show you in the same kind of tables that you had on your system, it's not going to help you as well.
So we can do a threat model on the effectiveness of introducing a tool, right? Where one of the risks is actually that the tool is not going to be effective, is actually going to cause more work, is going to remove people from other projects that are more important, and actually going to have a negative impact, right? And is going to have access to all these credentials, all these access, all these things, and may actually be a single point of failure for the business.
Yeah, because that's what we used to do that in Domino's, because we used to do when we were thinking about buying a tool, we used to do a slide on business value proposition, which kind of was a kind of broken down little threat model to make sure that what we are buying we actually need and is going to actually work for us, instead of just putting money down the drain.
That's pretty cool. Nikolai, can we bring you in? You got a really cool question, right?
Let's get to this. Hi. Yeah, sorry, it's the classic problem, isn't it, with the mute button? Sorry, there's some background noise. Apologies, but yeah, no, some really good points made, and I think that engagement piece is really important. I just want to go back a little bit, really, for that piece. So for us, it's been really useful to have those discussions. James, I think, spoke about engagements and speaking to the wider business, and it's been a discussion point really for the panel for the most part. And so forums for us has really worked. and we've opened the door to outside of technology and having the business represent us, because as you mentioned, or as was mentioned, the people team or HR are really useful in having that background checks and some of the controls around the people we employ, et cetera, et cetera. So having a threat model in that space and just talking about security to them starts to open the door. And it really brings them in terms of the value they can deliver to this common goal. So I think that was really powerful for us. And strangely enough, we saw the attendance increase every quarter, mainly because we started to deliver content that was really interesting, like attack vectors, and almost thinking about what was happening in the outside world, which is quite stimulating for some people. Other people were dropping off because you could just gauge it, right? But yeah, we had some good success in business engagement. I think that was really useful. I just wanted to make that point. Hopefully that was useful.
Absolutely. Look, I had so many experiences that once you explain sometimes the person who thinks of business, right? And yes, these are good professionals. They're really good at what they do. They never really thought about security. They are even more scary than we are, because it's almost like when they understand that this world that they thought was rock solid actually is full of gaps and problems. They go, well, if you tell me that you can manipulate that data, then what I would do is this. And then I would do that. And you can almost see them going, because they almost know the blind spot of the business, right? They know that, well, the business, if I know that that's my source of truth, but if you're telling me that source of truth can be manipulated this way, holy shit, right? Then we have a big problem, right? Because that's all we'll do. And if you, I remember this system for the e-commerce system where the prices were set in a particular part of the workflow. So that means that if you manipulated the price tag, the price value, right, of a particular product that you're selling, there was points of no return that were actually quite early in the shopping cart system. And then you think, and there was insane, because then you say, if you find a vulnerability in that early bid, there's nobody from the moment the order is on the shopping cart to then you ship it, there's nobody there who's going to go, hold on, this cost 50 quid a pop and we're selling it for 2 quid, right? And I think those are business level vulnerabilities, right? They are exploitations. And I think we are I think, Nicholas, your example of creating materials that the business understands, let them think, is actually really good, because they also start to ask good questions and from us, right? And I actually think that sometimes we in security don't get asked good questions, which is a problem, because we can provide good answers, but we're not being asked really good questions by the business to say, I care about this. What are you doing to protect this? I have this risk. I don't want to have this risk. What can you do about it?
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, and I think to add to that as well, I think what Nikolai mentioned as well, I always say to everyone, especially if you do end user awareness kind of training, or you do kind of reaching out to business units, you always mention that, every single person is essentially an extension to a security team. So when you can translate and get on board and for example, you show a nice, for example, video, or sometimes you deliver a training session where you can translate into some, layman terms. For example, sometimes you can even give, for example, some simple physical examples, which I just came back from holiday, for example. So yeah, we lost our key cards, and one of the key cards was lost in a room. So we just went to the front desk and we said, oh, sorry, we lost our key card. Can we get a new one? And they just gave us a key card and they just asked for a room number. And I walked away and I was like, that's a big security risk. Nobody asked, even though they might have seen us in a hotel, nobody asked us to ID ourselves or even to show us to the room. They just gave us a key card. I could have picked up the key card for any room in the hotel, went there, took their stuff and left.
There's an opportunity to consult there, I think, Marius. I've got to change my username because it's Nicolau is my surname. Marius is my first name. Sorry, guys, if I might just point that out. It might be.
No, that's cool.
Yeah.
One point there, Dinis, you said, and
right. All right, cool.
I was going to start bringing out the really controversial stuff when I heard that. I took one thing that I found is really good, and I've seen work, is as an example to try and introduce people into this, I use the target data breach in 2013, the Thanksgiving data breach. It's very easy to understand. It's actually quite interesting. And if you can deliver it in a really interesting way, then people start to come to you. So if you can give really interesting answers, really engaging answers to those questions when people come to you, not just say, thanks for telling us, you'll hear back from us in a week. If someone comes to you and you say, oh, that's really good, I'm really glad you showed me this. It means that this, and this won't happen. Great job. Just those little things are so useful.
Yeah. Because similar to what you said, for example, I used to do, even graphs. So for example, we built in a cloud system, we built a honeypot that gives you great data, So you can, for example, show, look, we're getting 400,000 hits per 24 hours, and we rely on you guys to make sure that, you don't click the links, you don't do this, that's where for example, you can show even the world map where the hits are coming from, what, potential, operating systems they use and things like that. You can just, as long as you explain in sort of layman terms, you get people fired up, and they're like, and especially, if you translate that into sort of, because I think one point to add as well, I think people always do sort of phishing sort of training and kind of incentives in the wrong sense, and they trying to reward people that that, for example, didn't click a link or did that. But you need to reward people that, for example, reports and brings you those phishing emails and things like that, that they can spot you, and then that's where the true value is.
James has some really cool videos. You need to publish that stuff, man.
I'm going to get some permission. I'm going to get some permission to publish them, and I'm going to put together a talk.
We need to inspire the world with what you've been doing, man.
Yeah, Marius raises their hand.
Hey.
Yeah, hi. Just to reiterate on the visualization, really, that of the threat modeling. So if it is on a visual, it's a lot better. So typically risk assessments for me have been on spreadsheets, and they're really hard to sell, really. So just to reiterate the point that picture speaks 1,000 words, and I think therein lies the secret of success, really, by showing that graphic of listen, these are our touch points, and we're aware of potentially the exposures around this and this, and that's as to quote, is really powerful.
Yeah, definitely. I think always, when you go from Excel, spreadsheets and things like that, when you can translate into graphs and especially trend lines and trends, and where things can go wrong or where we're heading at and where the risks are, I think that obviously it makes so much easier. It makes such a compelling message to the business, especially in terms of risk. So yeah, it's much easier in that sense.
So what are you guys using for your graph, right? Because I use Jira because it's, for me, the best graph database I've seen, because the nodes are really good. And things like Neo4j and some of the other graph databases, which are great when you have millions and millions of nodes, but we don't have that problem, right? If you take a spreadsheet, right, like, take the NIST CSF framework, or take GDPR, or take your assets, you don't have 50 million assets that you want to manage. You have probably 20, 30, 50, 200 categories, right? And they fit into a smaller graph. So what graph engines are you guys using to capture your stuff?
I use Visio, which was quite painful initially, really, to try and make a start, because I wasn't really thinking what else I could use. And then, Marius, you mentioned the Microsoft tool. I love those preconceived icons you can just deliver and then stretch connect lines. I think for me, it was just trying to be quick and easy. We had enough things to be doing as a small team, and I was looking for something effective enough to be able to demonstrate that this is the model that we feel represents, and these are the touch points. And you said about scalability. It's trying to find that balance, isn't it, really?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Visio is an interesting one, right? Because Visio has an insane power. I actually remember the first version before it got bought by Microsoft. Right, which was insane. I guess that shows how old I am, right? They had some really, really cool integrations, right? That kind of, I think, got lost a little bit into the whole thing. But in the beginning, there was this idea that you could start to create programmatically the Visio diagrams, because that's kind of what you want. Like, the problem here is that it's like XML and stuff like that. Like, you have to have the data stored in a place that scales, or else your diagrams become work of art, right? And if they become a work of art, they're hard to change, they're hard to manipulate, they don't version control well, right? Eventually they become out of date, right? Like every team has some big diagrams sometimes, right? Hopefully, right? About how the things there, but you ask them the question, is this up to date? They're going, oof. Well, now that's let me know when you find the answer, right? And the reason why is because unless the diagrams get created almost dynamically or get created from live data or from live systems or from a graph that is easy to manipulate, then they will be out of date, and then they become less useful because the incremental cost of keeping them up to date doesn't exist because you only have big costs to update at moments in time, and that doesn't scale at that level.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the same point, whenever we discuss with any kind of tooling within security, it comes down to usability versus security. So if you can't use it on a day-to-day basis, then it becomes cumbersome and hard to change and hard to adapt to your threat model, to your working, on the fly, especially in these agile kind of times when we need to be quick to change, it just gets left behind. And that's the problem. You need to make sure that you have a tool that you can use and it's easy to manipulate, easy to graph and portray your threat model, but it's easy to change and it's easy to scale. And that's the balance that we do these days.
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
No, I was just gonna ask you guys to chip in.
I would say if there's any camera nerds out there, there's a saying, people ask you what the best camera is. It's like whatever's in your pocket. Right, whatever's right there and you can take a picture with, and if you've got, so I've previously used Threat Dragon, the beta OWASP software, but if you've got an organization that's using something like Miro or Lucidchart all day long and it's embedded in their process, and that's just going to be a much better tool, even though we know that there's better tools. That's the better tool because people have got it in their pocket. People are going to use it, and that's really, if you've got an organization that's using Visio to share documents and everyone can open it and everyone can access it from the same place, then that's 90% of your battle won.
And that's the ask for those tools. Please think in graphs, right? Please export your stuff into graph-like formats, right? Because if they could do it, and it sometimes kills me how they have such an insane opportunity, and for I get it, product directions, vision, etc., but they have such an insane opportunity, those diagramming tools and those places, that they could be so at the heart of an organization if they build the connectors, if they went to a mode of saying, we're not the data source, we're the visualization source of data. But they still locked into the idea that they want to be the data source. They want to be the place where that data exists. But that it's almost like there's no way for that to scale, because you end up creating work of art. It's almost there's the sweet spot where Marius, of course, right? There's an absolutely sweet spot that it's better to have a Visio or a Lucidchart or a diagram or even a PowerPoint or Google Slides diagram or whatever of something. They're not having it because it adds an insane amount of value. And sometimes that picture is worth 1,000 words because people go, oh, now I get that bit. But as soon as you want to zoom in, you have to live in graph world. Yeah. Right.
No, well said.
And in fact, what I found was very interesting was there's a weird sweet spot where you lose control of your I would say the beauty of your diagram, but what you gain are diagrams that are almost beautiful in their own way. So it's kind of like, it's a weird thing where you sometimes you can obsess on the quality and almost the visual communication of your diagram, right? Because you want the things to be there, aligned, but then as soon as reality comes into play, you go, shit, where do I put this icon? Now I need this line to go over there. And then you start to fudge because it doesn't represent reality anymore. The weird way is when you create diagrams programmatically, and actually there's some these really cool sessions in the summit. There's a lot of people trying to figure this out, threat models as code and diagram as code. I actually think that's the future, because in a way you lose control of the diagram almost design element a little bit, but you gain a real worldiness that is priceless. And sometimes, it gets too complex and it doesn't look good. I go, well, your diagram is too complex. Then refactor, have different levels of altitude, right? Have your graph structured in a different way.
I think that's where the world is going. We need to stop, clicking and typing. Everywhere is API integration. So
yeah.
If you can't integrate with something and bring the processes together, bring another useful tools into one API integration, you're going to get left behind. And that's what's happening these days with the walls, with whether it's security tooling, whether it's business tooling, it's all about API integration, plugging in one to another and making sure that combination gives you value.
Yeah. But okay, here's a question for you guys. Have you seen a GDPR structure in a graph or a PCI or an ISO 27 or a NIST CSF? Because we've now been importing them into Jira, and I find some cool spreadsheets, but I'm yet to find a nice graph structure hyperlinked, right? Because that's where it has to start, right?
Yeah, well, that's a business idea for you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, no, I haven't seen one yet. It's going to be fairly similar to a spirograph that I remember back in the 80s. So as a kid, just messing about with that and looking at what those shapes were. But it can be complex. But that layered approach really helps, as you said, if you break it down into subsections. I wanted to ask about threats. Actually, I wonder if I can open it up to the floor, really, in terms of threats, really, and how complex we can get. And Dinis, you mentioned getting lost in this stuff. And I could get lost in this stuff, in those video diagrams, just perfecting those lines and making sure we've got a good understanding. So someone mentioned to me, look, you should just have a couple of layers of threats, right? You should just have external, internal, and then you should just have a few of those, and really you couldn't get much difference. But I've seen threat models, and I've been wanting to really add business value by being a little bit more prescriptive on hacktivists and people that are gluing themselves to the floor for the right reasons. Sorry, I'm not attacking any of those. But then, how they could damage our business against those who are targeting, and will spend a lot of time trying to exploit vulnerabilities. So what are your thoughts on how deep that has to be or needs to be, really?
Well, I'll start with this, that say that it depends on your business. But for example, when I was working in Domino's, we built the whole kind of risk methodology and kind of risk matrix based on threat sophistication levels. So we're going to invest money up to a certain level. So obviously we're not going to go up to sort of say nation state or whatever groups, because that's obviously requires too much investment to mitigate risk against nation state. So we based our kind of program leveling to a particular level of threat sophistication, so we can directly attribute potential risks to specific threat sophistication. We can direct investment basically based on that risk. So you can spin it in that way, or you can do a threat models, I think, based on specific threat sophistication levels as well, based on whether you're building a system, you can probably, if you want, but obviously, as I say, it depends how much you want to expand, but you can probably build your kind of security program on a threat model, and you can just divide it into smaller chunks based on threat sophistication.
Yeah, well said.
Another good habit to get into is, sorry to be Mr. Textbook, but referring back to your personal analysis. So if you're updating your personal analysis, of course, say that. I've not said that ever. If you update your personal analysis every year, then that's a good place for you to try and find threats, right? You can find those threats in those individual silos in the PESTLE acronym.
Yeah,
I think Mario. So actually, that's to Mario's now, right? I feel for the original question, and in security, where I've seen this, right? I've seen a lot of times where we can be guilty of going into the science fiction realm, right? Where we start to go into these impossible scenarios where it should go. For me, what the other Marius said, which I think is spot on, is that you have to calibrate this with your threat actors, right? And your threat actors, in a way, determine. In fact, you might even need to do threat models that are different based on your threat actors, because your threat actors matter. You can have vulnerabilities that if you say this vulnerability can only be exploited by a certain type of threat actor, then, and if that threat actor is not currently, you have no data or no evidence to say that's a problem for you, or your mandate from your board or your exec is not to protect against them, right? Then you say, well, then I'm not going to materialize that. Then that threat for all purposes doesn't exist to your world because it's not there. And I think that's a great way to calibrate, because the irony here is sometimes the worst things for the business are not the super advanced, highly, technical stuff, is the things where there's a Venn diagram of the vulnerabilities that you have and the people that can do something about it. And this might not be very sophisticated, but guess what? They can do something about it. They motivated, they're going to be, be able to exploit it. So they, that's the ones kind of you need to focus on. So, and I think that's how you calibrate your threat models, by not going for the science fiction stuff. Like sometimes I've seen this secret management stuff and thinking, dude, like 50% of those vulnerabilities, you need admin, right? Like if you're already admin on that system, there's better things you can do, right? Than exploit that. So yes, they are vulnerabilities, but they just don't matter, right? Unless we're saying I'm protecting against a malicious developer, right? Or a developer has been compromised in this way. And then, but I would look at that as a completely different threat model where, yes, some of these might materialize, but I guarantee you there's probably even bigger things that the attackers, because they also are efficient, they will go first, right?
Yeah. That's why I'm just to add, sorry, a quick thing. I'm a big fan of MITRE ATT&CK, because that's how you build your layers. Because when I was building SOC programs, I always build layers based on where business is operating. So if it's operating in UK and those threat actors never attacked UK, it's highly unlikely that they're going to attack our company. Based on the industry you work in, based on geopolitical situation, and based on some other factors that based on those particular threats. So you can layer those layers basically on threat actors on your matrix. Then you can directly correlate that to data points of what you need to see in your SIEM. And then you can layer even defensive techniques where you can use to defend from those threat actors. And then you can do another layer on matrix where you can be proactive and do deception technologies. And that's your SOC framework built in there. So basically you build a SOC that aligns to threats that are relevant to your organization based on the geopolitical situation and where you are and what kind of business market you operate in. And I think that's kind of the perfect way to do it.
Yeah, fantastic.
And if you connect that to incidents, like if you're there for a little while, you should have data to support it, right? I really love this concept where this guy is saying that a 0-day is not an invisibility cloak, right? Like, it's not because somebody can pop you over here, that their actions are not going to leave some marks, right? And if you're paying attention to your incidents, you should be able to have a rational explanation for who did this.
Yeah.
And that should be pointing to your threat actors, right? It's like fraud, right? Like what kind of sophistication frauds are you having? Are you having fraud that's almost insane to detect with highly motivated people who are doing all sorts of crazy stuff, which I've seen, or you're doing fraud that's opportunistic? Once we look into them, we can even identify where they live, right? And those are different type of fraudsters, right? And your model needs to take into account who are you worried about, or else you're not efficient.
Yeah. No, and some really good points. And I was just going to bring up the Cisco issue, really, when some threat actors were able to grab some cookies from a Gmail, if I remember, or a Google account, really, and then overlay those back into the system, gain access into the systems, the Cisco systems, and grab some data, right? And you start to work out these scenarios, and you're saying actually this system's not accessible, and then you've got the kind of over the I don't know, drawbridge attacks like phishing, and you're relying on other controls. So for me, sometimes the lines blur between external and internal. Sometimes they can drop shots straight over the bow, right? And so it takes a lot of working. And again, it's hard not to get lost in that, but it is about self-control, as you mentioned, and keeping it at a layer where this actually might be sensible. But again, I never share that with my exec, and I'm always comfortable in saying, look, there are external actors that can manipulate this process, but we feel comfortable that the controls that are in place and we've tested them, etc., we can give you some assurance.
Yeah. And then you have data from instance to validate that, and use your pen tests and your code reviews and even your threat models to validate your assumptions. Like one of the reasons I always get my teams to investigate P3s as P2s and P2s as P1s is because the question I'm asking that I want to know, which is not immediately clear, is are all our other assumptions valid, right? Because if you take a P2 that it's a particular thing, you can investigate and get over it. But I want to know, well, hold on. We're able to detect it where we're supposed to do? Is this a more sophisticated attacker than we have? Do we have bigger vulnerabilities that we're not aware of? Because go look, almost use those incidents as real world proof. Yes, you might have dodged the bullet, but it could have been a missile. In fact, it could have been 50,000 bullets flying over you. They just saw one, and you're like, ooh, then let's make sure that we put into context. Did we dodge it because we were good, or did we dodge it because we just got lucky and the person turned right instead of turning left, right? So, but that should be on your threat models, right? Because then that should be on your analysis, because you go, hey, we know this is possible, but today, it hasn't happened. It doesn't mean it won't happen in the future.
Yeah, and insights from our perimeter and what's happening really help drive that. And as I said, in the way we use data a bit more now, and that could be so powerful in getting to the kind of an understanding of where we are and how strong that is. And sometimes that's actually a challenge, really, to feed those insights from our perimeter and establish those metrics really about those risk indicators. We've had 50,000 attempts across this particular type of vulnerability, right? You can see it on the IPS. Or whatever. Yeah. So, I think that's really powerful. And I think that's been a success factor, is to try and do something with those insights.
Cool. Well, I think we can, it's time drawing to a close. So I think the solution is yes, we want the business, right, to start using threat models because it's going to add a lot of value to their world. Any final comments from you guys?
I think just to summarize, use threat models extensively as much as you can, expand into the various business segments and show the value, especially if you can do it in a graph form. Teach, iterate, and make sure that people can apply those lessons themselves, and then you're going to get a great kind of return on investment in your security.
Cool. I couldn't have said better myself. Marius, James?
Make it digestible. That's the thing. If you're going to make people eat stuff, it's got to be digestible. That's my big takeaway from this. Yeah,
and me, keep it simple. Get to the end point with the least amount of resistance, and as Marius and we all said, is make sure the business are engaged and they're comfortable with the type of translation, James, as you mentioned.
Cool. All right, guys. That was a really good session, and I love the fact that threat model is evolving into we started having this conversation. It's really, really cool. Thanks, Marius, for putting this together, and I'll see you guys on the other sessions.
Brilliant. Thank you.